Some brand new reporting in the New York Times today on a confrontation of sorts inside the White House between Elon Musk and several members of Donald Trump's new cabinet, with Donald Trump sort of reduced to the role of spectator. The Times cites 5 people with knowledge of the confrontation, reports this about an argument between Elon Musk and Marco Rubio. Quote, "You fired nobody," Musk told Rubio, then scornfully added that perhaps the only person he had fired was a staff member from his Department of Government Efficiency. Rubio had been privately furious with Musk for weeks, ever since his DOGE team effectively shuttered an entire agency that was supposedly under Rubio's control, the United States Agency for International Development. Musk was not being truthful, Rubio said. What about the more than 1,500 State Department officials who took early retirement in buyouts? Didn't they count as layoffs, he asked sarcastically, whether Musk wanted him to rehire all those people just so he can make a show of firing them again. Then he laid out his detailed plans for reorganizing the State Department. Musk was unimpressed. He told Rubio he was, quote, good on TV, with the clear subtext being he wasn't good for much else. Where was Donald Trump in all this? The Times reports that he sat back as if he was watching a tennis match. Ultimately, he, quote, intervened to defend, wait for it, Rubio. Said he was doing a great job. Rubio has a lot to deal with, the president said. He's very busy. He's always traveling and on TV. And he has an agency to run. So everyone just needs to work together, end quote. And then for the first time since his inauguration, Trump put some restraints on Elon Musk. From this reporting, quote, from now on, he said, the secretaries would be in charge. The Musk team will only advise. Joining our coverage, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton, joins us. Christy and Michael are still here. Rev, I have been watching the Bannon-Musk power struggle with keen interest since it first emerged during the campaign. And I think I said on television, do not ever bet against the guy who was willing to go to jail to not testify before Congress, and the guy who sort of in I don't know if his life, I don't know enough about his life, but who seems to understand the base and the most powerful elements of the Trump base better than anybody in Trump land, and that is Steve Bannon. And I don't have any idea if Bannon has any role in all this, but it does seem like Musk has stumbled, not by taking more attention from Trump, which is how most people stumble, but by dirtying him up politically. The things that Musk is doing are not popular among Republican voters in Republican districts.
That's the whole point. I think that Musk could get away with a lot, but he cannot in any way endanger his popularity. When he starts seeing polls coming down based on things that Musk got him to do or that Musk did in his name, that gets his attention. You got to remember, a narcissist is about him. And when you are doing things that in any way injures or besmirches the image of the narcissist, he's got to react. All the logic in the world doesn't matter. Everything else doesn't matter. But wait a minute, he's making me look bad. I don't care how rich he is. And I think that that's what Musk is going to run into here.
What's interesting, though, is that this is a different Trump, because the co-presidency has been going on since the beginning, and that doesn't bother Trump. What bothers him, and what has always, I think, sustained him politically, is this reptilian survival sense that if all the Republicans are voted out of office in 2 years, that is a much bumpier road.
It's a much bumpier road. He knows that it will kill anything that he wants to leave as a legacy. And he has no way of stopping that if the polls keep dropping. I think that we really have to understand Donald Trump, at the end of the day, is about Donald Trump. And he's not going to share that with anyone. Spotlight, he doesn't care. He knows he's the president, and Musk is not the president and never will be. But what he doesn't want to be is an unpopular president with no legacy. He wants the Trump library. I mean, what does he do after he leaves? He can't change the law and run a third time. That's just talk. He wants the library. He wants to be respected. He wants people to want him to come around the world. And if
He's going to build Trump Mars.
That's right.
All these rocket men in his pocket.
That's right. I mean, there's a man talking about buying whole countries. I want to own Greenland.
Yeah.
So that's how he thinks. If Musk gets in the way of that self-image that he has, as unrealistic as it may be, that is where you're going to start seeing division.
America First is inspiring a nationalistic backlash from our neighbors to the north and south. In Mexico, the government and businesses have revived a Made in Mexico campaign amid calls for boycotts of American companies and products. Support for President Claudia Sheinbaum is surging as she vows to levy retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. In Canada, stores are pulling California wines and Kentucky bourbon off the shelves with the message, "For the good of Canada." A new online shop is selling hats that say "Never 51," a reference to President Trump's persistent talk about annexing Canada, jokes that Canadian officials have begun to take seriously. Joining us now is Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Senior Counselor at Centerview Partners, and author of the weekly Substack newsletter, Home and Away. Richard, how did our closest friends, neighbors, allies get to Canada first and Mexico first?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is we've essentially declared economic war on them, trade war with these tariffs, which are inconsistent with the agreement, what was originally NAFTA, then the USMCA. They thought they'd entered an open-ended era of collaboration on economic matters, and suddenly they find themselves the target of American tariffs. They are, deeply, deeply dependent on access to the American market, overwhelmingly dependent on it. So this is a real threat to their economic, existence, if you will, for the foreseeable future. Then I think the president's also ratcheted up. You talked about, Chris, the talk of the 51st state. There's been some supposedly exchanges, really confrontational between him and soon-to-be former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where the president's raised the possibility of redrawing some of the maps between the United States and Canada. Like other NATO countries, Canada is unhappy with American distancing in the security area. We could go on. And then Mexico, obviously, all the talk about going after cartels and so forth. That kind of extraterritorial American military involvement, shall we say, raises up some controversial pieces of history. So for all these reasons, our two of our three most important trading partners are essentially now increasingly defining themselves in opposition to us.
Yeah, they are our most important, our biggest trading partners. We reported on the bourbon earlier this week. Now we're talking about wine being pulled from shelves. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. California was already having a rough time, parts of it, with the wildfires. Now this. There's concern that it will expand to the tourist industry. There's been anecdotal reporting about people canceling trips. Canada and Mexico, by far, bring the most tourists into the United States. UK's third, and it's a distant third. So I know that the message has been kind of no pain, no gain, but is there a point beyond which the pain is disproportionate to the gain and it might be recognized by the administration?
My sense is this is going to be one of those wars where there's no winners. Everyone's going to lose. Each of us is dependent on the other. You can't, even if Canada, Mexico's economic dependence on us is greater than ours is on theirs, still a lot of American industries are extraordinarily dependent on what comes across either our northern or southern border. So I think at some point there's going to be a mutual interest in finding a way to back down. I also think, just to make a larger point, one of the great strategic advantages of the United States is we get up every morning and our relations with our immediate neighbors is good. That has given us the luxury for centuries to focus on other parts of the world. Well, if we now have a situation where we can't cooperate with them, where we don't work with them against terrorism, or they see us as a threat, that will have implications, not just for our bilateral relations, but for America's ability to act anywhere and everywhere.
After Trump imposed the tariffs first on Canada earlier this week, Prime Minister Trudeau had a rather extraordinary assessment of what he thinks Donald Trump wants. Here it is.
One thing he has said repeatedly, that what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us, is the second half of his thought. Now, first of all, that's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state.
Well, the New York Times is reporting Trump told Trudeau he didn't believe that the treaty that demarcates the border between the two countries was valid. That's according to 4 people with firsthand knowledge of the conversation. Canadian officials seem to be now legitimately worried that Trump is serious about this 51st state thing. Is there a dispute about our border that we're unaware of?
No, there's no dispute there, but we've generated it as an issue as part of a larger pattern in foreign policy. We've seen it with the challenge or threat to Panama's control of the canal, even though they had done nothing to deserve it. We see all the talk of Greenland, even though Denmark's been one of the most stalwart supporters of the United States in NATO, the threat to Canada and so forth. One of the ironies of this in the short run, it's totally upended Canadian politics. 6 weeks ago, the Conservative Party candidate was more than 25 points ahead in the polls against either Justin Trudeau or anybody else from the Liberal Party. Guess what? Now the 2 people who want to succeed Justin Trudeau in the Liberal Party are ahead of the polls, ahead of their Conservative challenger. It's a good lesson that we're not the only country that feels nationalism. If we bully too much, if we push too hard, others will push back, and they will increasingly define themselves against us, and that won't be good for any of us.
When you see Canada and you see Mexico rallying around their leaders, including, as you say, Justin Trudeau, who was down, 20 points or 25 points, could Trump ultimately and unintendedly be remaking the world order against himself?
Quite possibly, and I think we're beginning to see signs of it in Europe, where people are unhappy with what looks to be somewhat, to use a strong word, well, we'll use a safer word, distancing from Ukraine. Some would say abandonment. Obviously, the cozying up to Russia. In Taiwan, there's real questions about American willingness to stand by Taiwan against China. There's those who look at all this and they say, is the United States making the world safe for spheres of influence? China would dominate Asia, Russia would dominate Europe. That would mean we would dominate this part of the world. Well, among the many problems is people in this part of the world don't want to be dominated by the United States. People in other parts of the world don't want to be dominated by Russia or China. So American foreign policy now seems to be moving on a trajectory that very few will support.
Richard Haass, to be continued. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that talks aimed at ending the war will be held next week in Saudi Arabia between American and Ukrainian officials. In a post on social media, Zelensky revealed that he will travel to meet with the Saudi Crown Prince on Monday and that his team will then stay for meetings with their U.S. counterparts. Russia not involved in these talks. President Trump did say yesterday that, quote, a lot of progress has been made in recent days with both Ukraine and Russia. However, this just in, Joe, a few moments ago, President Trump took to Truth Social, and I will simply read it to you. Based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now, and we should note there's been widespread attacks throughout Ukraine in the last 24 or so hours. Trump goes on to write, I am strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions, other sanctions, and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final settlement agreement on peace is reached. And he urges Russia and Ukraine to both get to the negotiating table before it is too late. So, Joe, a rare moment, at least publicly, of toughness from Trump himself against Moscow.
We know this is fascinating. And of course, this follows, again, we talked about this, what happened during his first term, where you would have Donald Trump saying things, whether it was at Helsinki, answering the question that you asked, or just making other statements or other tweets during his first term that would cause American allies great consternation. But then that would be followed up by some of the toughest sanctions from the United States Senate, the Republicans in the United States Senate. So let's see what happens in the coming days. Let's bring around NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simon live in Moscow. Keir, a lot to follow, obviously not just in the U.S. and Europe, but in Russia. What are you hearing there?
Well, Joe, I think that Truth Social post from President Trump indicates something that he has been signaling, I think, actually, honestly, for some weeks, which is that I think the Trump administration is realizing that negotiating with the Kremlin is going to be a challenge. That's certainly the message that we have received here in Moscow. And Joe, we traveled 8 hours from Moscow to Kursk region with the first U.S. television news team to make it to the Russian-controlled part of Kursk since the Ukrainians took some of that area. Now, people may know that Kursk is a place that was a critical rallying point back in February 2022 for a massive buildup of forces along that border, tanks, artillery, and those tanks and artillery poured into Ukraine's neighboring Kharkiv region. We got there, and one of the first things that happened was a air raid siren, an air raid warning. I want you to watch and take a listen. Russian message that's being broadcast there is attention, missile danger, proceed to shelter. What's interesting is, look at those civilians, that car just walking as if nothing is happening. The message is that war in that part of Russia has just become part of normal life. We talked to people there, and we wanted to ask them whether President Trump is right to say that Russia is ready for peace. We spoke to the mayor in a town called Rilsk, which you saw just there in those pictures. He said, okay, yeah, we want peace, but we must also liberate our territory, he said. Another 39-year-old construction worker we spoke to said, everything rests on Zelensky, not on Putin. He wasn't prepared to accept in any way that Putin was responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. Now, of course, there is draconian legislation here in Russia that means up to 15 years jail for people criticizing the Russian army. But what I think all of that tells you, and we reported out plenty more on this, is actually how challenging it is going to be to get to a ceasefire because of places like Kursk. And we had the opportunity to interview the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry. And again, despite President Trump saying that he wants a ceasefire fast, she said, okay, they're not in a hurry.
So how quickly should we expect there to be a summit?
Are you good in math? It depends on the speed.
How quickly should we expect there to be a summit, if there is one, between President Trump and President Putin? How soon do you think that might happen?
It depends on the both sides and the speed of the both sides.
Is Russia in a hurry?
We are not in a hurry, but we are ready.
Jonathan, my understanding from talking to experts here in Russia who know the Kremlin well is that President Putin and the Kremlin are saying to the Trump administration, okay, yeah, we want a meeting, but first we want to know what you're going to bring to the table, what you're potentially going to agree to. Jonathan?
And we begin with a story that has really striking revelations, and it's from inside the Trump cabinet meeting. And this is something where we're going to learn a lot in the next couple of moments. You may have heard a little bit about it, but I'm going to go through the evidence, the facts here, because it is exactly what this Trump White House and a lot of what Elon Musk is up to. It paints a picture of it in a way that's different from what we've heard in public, from all of the usual PR and the political press conferences and the efforts to tell a certain story. We're now going to go tonight together behind the scenes. This is reporting that shows what many would call a dysfunctional White House, and you'll see why. People at war with themselves and each other over the efforts to basically dismantle large parts of the federal government by someone who doesn't run the federal government, wasn't elected to the position, Elon Musk, and clashing with the very people who, of course, the president also picked to be in charge of these departments. And we often draw on different reporting around here. You know that from watching the news, right? We mention different stories. This is from the New York Times. Credit to their reporters, their journalists getting this story out. And it is a bombshell. The Times reports that Musk basically ended up in a clash, a conflict with much of the cabinet. And that was Thursday this week. And laced into these other officials, some of whom are important, right? If you're picked to run the State Department, you are a pretty important official within the government. And just to put it clearly, we are talking right now about an unelected billionaire sitting in on these important meetings and going at people in very intense terms. And the substance matters as well as, quite frankly, the emotion and the gossip of this, because it's all part of how this government is being run. Musk going at Secretary of State Rubio, according to the New York Times, basically saying that Rubio was not firing anybody. Quote, "You have fired nobody." And Rubio responds, "What about the more than 1,500 State Department officials who took early retirement in buyouts? Didn't they count as layoffs?" Rubio asking then sarcastically if Musk wanted him to rehire all those people just so he could make a show of firing them again. These are two people at odds over the department that Rubio runs, and the subtext there is about who is being honest or accurate and who is just trying to put on a show. Musk then, the Times reports, was, quote, unimpressed and told Rubio actually he was the show, that he was, quote, good on TV. The subtext, the Times says, being that he was not good for much else. And let's be clear, both of these men have risen in their careers through some aspect of public show. Rubio ran for president. Musk was on the campaign trail. He's made himself into a big deal out in public, but that's how they deride each other in private, basically saying, you're not for real. No, you're not for real. No, you just do it on TV. Here we are talking about it on TV. Now, the Times reports the meeting was actually hastily scheduled because Trump's cabinet members, again, the most important people he's picked to run the agencies, had reached a kind of breaking point about what they call Elon Musk's chainsaw approach here to the cuts. And the meeting was in the cabinet room. The president was presiding, 20 officials attending. Then the Veterans Affairs Secretary, Doug Collins, using this opportunity to go after the way Musk has fired veterans and officials who work at the VA. We heard from one this week, for example. And what's interesting here, as you're going to see, is the dissent, the concern is internal. It's not just people protesting or people who've been ousted from the government. This is Trump's pick for the VA, saying Musk should not wield a blunt instrument and cleave off everyone from Veterans Affairs. They need to be strategic. Then you have Sean Duffy, who runs transportation, also going at Musk. What am I supposed to do, Mr. Duffy says, according to the Times report here. I have multiple plane crashes to deal with now. And your people want me to fire air traffic controllers? The question kind of makes the argument that that sounds absurd, dangerous even. And Musk then responds to that logical sounding question and says, well, Duffy's basically a liar. Quote, Mr. Musk told Mr. Duffy his assertion was a lie. And throughout all of this, the Times reports that a president who, of course, used to do pretend boardroom meetings on his reality show, Trump sat back in his chair, arms folded as if he were watching a tennis match. The meeting ended. Trump said that he does support Musk's ongoing cuts, but that cabinet members are supposed to run their agencies. And he said something that is actually a restoration of what the rules are supposed to be, and it is a sign of dysfunction, and many experts would say failure, that the president, with all his power, had to say this out loud. I really want to emphasize this because it's extraordinary reporting. That's why we're leaving it up on the screen. The Times with quite a scoop here. Quote, from now on, Trump said, the secretaries would be in charge. The Musk team would only advise. Translation, that is a demotion for Elon Musk.
Brian, I want to turn to you now. You know, we got back here in the States, we've gotten the monthly jobs report. Talk us through what the reaction has been in the markets. And we're also starting to see notes coming from the Oval Office where President Trump is speaking. It looks like he is talking about jobs. What more do we know?
Yeah, we're getting these feeds out, and again, we were trying to get the playback, essentially, because we won't actually see the video until a few minutes from now, but it sounds like the president is trying to take claim over the manufacturing numbers that we saw in the jobs report, as you mentioned at the top here, 151,000 jobs added in the month of February, and in the sector of manufacturing, there were 10,000 jobs gained in the month. They're touting that as kind of a sign of the tariffs working, but I want to point out that the survey period for this February jobs report was essentially before most of these tariffs were put in place, because, again, what we're talking about is a report that was released today, but it covers the essentially a second or third week of February, where it was kind of well before this round of 25% tariffs were put on both Canada and Mexico. The unemployment rate did tick up to 4.1%. Historically, that's not anything too big. And in fact, some of the Wall Street banks that have opined in on the jobs report this morning have described this as decent. That's the word that JP Morgan Chase described it as. And I was just messaging with an economist that said it was kind of a snoozer, that this jobs report didn't really tell us anything that new or that changing about the structure of this economy. But of course, a lot of focus on those numbers ahead of you about federal government employment. Did that, in fact, weigh on this report, as you have DOGE claiming that 75,000 federal workers took them up on their buyout? This particular jobs report says that 10,000 federal workers there were 10,000 fewer federal workers in the workforce as of February. That doesn't really line up with the 75,000 figure that DOGE says. But of course, as I mentioned, there is a lag because this report is as of the middle of February. Nonetheless, this jobs report shows that the economy is still chugging along pretty all right. But of course, the question is, what does it look like in the months to come? We'll see if the president has any other announcements in his appearance right now with regards to the tariffs, which could certainly weigh on employment going forward, but not too much to be gleaned from the tariff impact to employment, at least as of the numbers that we got this morning, Christina.
Yeah, it's important to remember, and I always have to remind myself, these reports look a month backwards, so there's always a bit of a lag. We are seeing a few new reports coming out on the wires that Trump has said Canada has tremendously high tariffs on lumber, and has also said we may do reciprocal tariffs as early as today. Now, those are coming out from wire reports, the Oval Office. Obviously, we're going to wait for the full remarks to get context on what exactly that means. But, Jason, I want to turn to you. You know, this report says 10,000 federal workers were laid off last month. But does that tell the whole story? Because you're still waiting. Like, I even know people in D.C. who are just waiting to get fired, essentially. You know, they're in NGOs or other contractors that they know are not going to get removed. So technically they're still employed, but they're de facto going to be joining these ranks. Are we expecting a much bigger number potentially next month?
Yeah, we're certainly expecting a bigger number of federal employees. This basically tells us where things were through February 12th, not what's after that. But look, when it comes to the macroeconomy, frankly, I'd look at private sector jobs. I don't think the federal government should be thought of as a jobs program. When you're thinking about federal jobs, ask what they're doing. At the IRS, they're collecting taxes that are owed. When we have fewer of them, we're going to miss out potentially on billions of dollars of what will end up being tax cheating. When they're dealing with international AIDS programs, you're talking about children dying. So around the world. So the point of those federal jobs isn't to help the economy. It's to do, the important work that they're doing. And that's what most concerns me there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's not funny, but I've already heard people, it's tax season. People are already making jokes about, well, do we really need to fire? Is anybody going to be working at the IRS by the time they go to see if we've paid our taxes or not? I also want to ask you, the administration is saying, the uncertainty is kind of a natural adjustment, that this will work itself out. Is that necessarily true? And how long can the economy endure this level of uncertainty?
The uncertainty is 100% caused by the administration. They've said they need to detox, make a change. They didn't need to announce 25% tariffs, then take them off for a month, then put them back on, then partly take them off, then further partly take them off, then say they're putting them back on. None of that has anything to do with Joe Biden, anything to do with detox. Those are all their choices. That's what's fueling the uncertainty. And, we can debate the magnitude, but the sign for the economy is clear. It's a minus sign.
And we've got some new reports coming out of those remarks President Trump is making right now. We're waiting for that tape to play back. But we've got, speaking of tariffs, President Trump has now said EU has been a terrible abuser on tariffs. And India has agreed to cut tariffs way down. So, Governor, I want to turn to you now. We've seen President Trump, flinch a little bit and bow to pressure, pulling back slightly on DOGE, pulling back slightly, given this 30-day reprieve on tariffs. But it seems like this is a really big gamble with the economy, which is why voters put him into the office in the first place. How much do you think voters are going to be willing to take of this so-called short-term pain?
Well, whenever prices go up, Christina, people don't like it, and they helped elect him because they felt that prices were too high, and while they may have moderated a little bit, they were still too high. So it's all about, I think, what you said earlier as you were ready to host this program. It's all about jobs, 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 and also about prices, prices, prices. And so, look, the problem we have now is there's so much disruption. I mean, there's disruption now talking about the EU. We know about the disruption connected to Ukraine. Then we look at the disruption between Canada and Mexico. And these disruptions, what it really does is it freezes capital. People don't know where to invest. And at the same time, if in fact these tariffs go through, we're going to pay the price. Tariffs are taxes, plain and simple. Now, the idea that we have had countries that have, dumped their products, that means they sold them for less than what it cost them to make. That's part of what China did. That's why President Obama went and had put tariffs on solar panels, and he put tariffs on tires, because unfair trading practices shouldn't be tolerated. But the way to handle that is to sit down and discuss it country to country, and try to get things on a level playing field. But the Canada and Mexico business, and it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. The auto parts that go back and forth between countries. This is not a good decision, and I think that's why one day it's on and the next day it's not, and then he gets riled up and says we're going to put it on, and one of his advisors said we won't, and then they see the market go down. So it's the instability that creates the challenge, and it's too early to assess where we're headed on this. It's too early to assess where voters are on this, but we're going to find out soon enough where we are and where this settles.
And Governor, speaking of that uncertainty, you're from Ohio. The auto industry is huge in Ohio. I've been to auto plants in Ohio. Talk about, one thing we learned during COVID is when you disrupt a supply chain, it doesn't get repaired as quickly as it can break down. If these supply chains start to get disrupted with all this uncertainty, what could the ripple effects be for a state like Ohio, for Michigan, for these industries?
Unemployment. I mean, if you, in fact, are having a disrupted supply chain and the big companies. Look, the reason why he provided the 30-day relief to the automakers is because what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to make the next year's model? And if they are frozen in place, what are they going to do? They just can't have people sit there and not do anything. So then that leads to layoffs. And so I think that's what the automakers told him. I think that is why he had the response he's had. It's a 30-day response, but again, it's uncertainty. And I can tell you in the business world, when there is uncertainty, people won't invest, they won't execute, and things get frozen. And that's not good for anybody. But again, let's see where this all comes down, because I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, Christina. None of us do. I mean, it's harder to predict Trump than it is to predict the weather.
I wish that weren't true, but I'm going to move on. Look, Jason, the other thing, speaking of confusion, is speaking to Canadian officials, speaking to Mexican officials. We've been talking about it all week. They were confused to begin with about what exactly the administration wanted in response not to enact these tariffs. Now there's new confusion over what exactly the USMCA covers. Now, remember, that's the deal the Trump administration did in its first term to replace NAFTA. But it's unclear what products are in, what products are out. By the time they figure this out, these sanctions are going back into place tariffs are going back into place in 3 weeks. Does the temporary tariff relief even matter if it's going into place by the time they probably figure out what counts and what doesn't?
Yeah, no, it's just incredibly complicated right now to think about the amount of time and effort that companies and lawyers are paying. For example, there were things under USMCA that faced a 0.1% tariff, and they'd say, you know what, we'll just pay the tariff rather than figure out whether the USMCA applies or not. Now, whether the USMCA applies or not is the difference between 0 and 25. They're all hiring lawyers. They're all trying to figure it out. And every dollar that a business is spending figuring out how to comply with these dollars is $1 less they're spending investing in American workers, in jobs, in the future of our economy. Just another reason why this uncertainty is just really, really hurting us.
I want to bring in NBC's Garrett Haake, who's in Toronto. Ron Insana is CNBC's senior analyst and CEO of IFI AI. Charlie Sykes is an MSNBC contributor and columnist, and NBC's Christine Romans is here with me on set. Okay, Ron, you heard what Chairman Powell just said. What are business leaders telling you about this level of uncertainty?
Well, I mean, I think that's the key word, Chris, and neither markets nor business leaders like uncertainty. They would prefer clarity in and around any changes in policy. As Jason Furman was saying in the last hour, whether it's around business policy, fiscal policy, trade policy, a roadmap that's established and well understood allows for businesses to plan for the future. But this on-again, off-again tariff and trade war that is ongoing is creating all kinds of difficulties for businesses to make plans on procuring inputs for production here in the United States or exporting to other markets overseas. And so this level of uncertainty is undesirable on a wide variety of fronts. Even consumers are somewhat concerned about this. So for the moment, this is the order of the day. And until we get more clarity around what's going to happen, I would expect to see volatility in the financial markets for certain. I think Jay Powell made some calming statements about saying that the economy was in good shape. And that may have been what was behind the bounce off the lows that we saw today, but there's still a great concern about whether or not this trade war, as it were, is being conducted in a way that would help either markets or the economy overall.
Well, let me ask you, Ron, about what we just heard from the president. We haven't gotten this, what we call the play out yet, but we do have some poll notes about it. So Trump started talking about Canada and dairy products. He talked about a tremendously high tariff on lumber. He said Canada makes it impossible to sell lumber and dairy products to Canada. So here's what he said then, Ron. They'll be met with the exact same tariff unless they drop it. We may do it as early as today, or we may wait until Tuesday, POTUS said of yet other tariffs on Canada. When folks out there hear that, whether you're Jerome Powell or you're a business owner or you're an everyday American who's watching their 401k, what are you to make of that?
Well, look, it's just confusing for everybody. I mean, there is really no one out there who fully understands the method here that is ongoing. I mean, look, as was said in the last hour, you know, in the renegotiation of NAFTA, the USMCA, we picked up, you know, nearly 0.5% of market share of the Canadian dairy market, and so. You know, the USMCA wasn't really all that different from NAFTA. There weren't great strides made that altered the course of trilateral trade among the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. I think there are just more questions than there are answers. The automakers obviously went to the president and said, look, we import parts from Canada. We import parts from Mexico. We make final assembly here. Having this type of on and off conversation disrupts their process of producing goods. And so it's hard to explain any of this because it is so, you know, to borrow a Beatles term and a term associated with another event in American history, so helter-skelter. I mean, we just really can't track what's going on here. And markets this week have suffered their worst declines in the last 2 years. So yeah, it's hard to explain or make of what the president is suggesting. And, you know, trying to renegotiate a year before we were supposed to with Canada and Mexico. One seems premature and also seems in many ways not productive either for the economy or for financial markets here at home.
Which brings me to you, Garrett. And again, I want to reiterate what the president just said, that there could be some new tariffs as early as today, or we may wait until Tuesday. Now, that literally just happened, so I know you don't have time to get reaction to that. But already before he said that, what were folks in Canada telling you?
Well, Chris, let me just add that the White House's official policy on additional tariffs towards Canada has been the steel and aluminum tariffs that could go into effect next week and the so-called reciprocal tariffs that would go into effect on April 2nd. If they've created a whole new category in the last 24 hours, that wouldn't be terribly shocking within the confines of how we think about the Trump administration, but it would certainly be a surprise to people here in Canada, where I cannot overstate enough the sense of frustration and confusion and even betrayal I've heard from Canadians. that their closest ally, America, would behave in this way towards them, both by imposing these tariffs and just the manner in which the president speaks about Canada. A short time ago, I interviewed the Premier of Ontario, the largest province in Canada, who's really been the tip of the spear on the Canadian response. And his sort of key takeaways to me is, as these issues tend to fluctuate back and forth, he's not removing Canada's response to the tariffs until he's totally confident that Trump has backed down. And it seems like this war could only escalate. Here's some of what Doug Ford told me a short time ago.
It's more confusion. The only thing certain about yesterday was uncertainty moving forward. And with investments in the U.S. and Canada, everything's stalled right now. And it's really, really concerning. So we're going to continue on. And I always say in every interview, Canadians love Americans. I love Americans. We love the U.S. I lived there for 20 years. And this is insanity.
And Chris, that's a sentiment I've heard over and over again, too, from Canadians, that they don't see sort of regular Americans as responsible for this. They very much see President Trump as responsible for this. But it's all of Americans who are going to get punished. They are quite confident in Canada that Americans are going to lose their jobs over this. American companies are losing market share. $1 billion worth of American liquor, give or take, is sold in Canada. Those products are all pulled off the shelves right now. Their bottom line will go down. And Doug Ford's talking about raising the prices for electricity that Canada exports to New York and Minnesota, other northern states. So this could get worse for American consumers' bottom line, as well as Canadians, before it gets better.
Garrett, it looks very cold there. Thank you for standing out in the cold for us and for sharing your reporting. It's important. Appreciate it. Christine, let me tell you a couple of anecdotal things I've heard in the last couple of days, and then you can give me the bigger picture. And it's simply this. It seemed like a few days ago I had friends saying things like, well, I was thinking about buying this or that. I feel like I need to buy it sooner because I don't know if prices are going to go up. And then that seemed to switch over the last 24 hours or so to maybe, I don't know if I should buy anything. I don't know what my economic future is. My 401k is tanking. They talk about the real effect on consumers and buying.
So uncertainty is the enemy of decision making, right? Whether you're a company or whether you're a person who's trying to make a big ticket item purchase, but also chaos is really an enemy of confidence. And so that's what we're seeing right now for so many consumers and for businesses. When I talk to businesses, especially in the auto parts and the auto part of the economy, they're not going to be hiring a bunch of people this week, right? If they were thinking about expanding, because they don't know what next month is going to look like. These are long supply time industries that really are facing major chaos, and that causes a dampening of economic activity. And that's what we're watching here. You've got a real vibe shift from businesses and from consumers over the past couple of months, and it's because of the chaos that's happening here. I'll make one last point about consumers. About half of Americans own stocks directly, right? So you've seen this Wall Street turmoil. It's getting a lot of attention. Everybody has to go to the grocery store. You have tariffs on 20% tariffs on Chinese items. You have tariffs that are on some Canadian and Mexican goods. You have tariffs threatened on lumber and all these other things. Prices will rise. That means every American will feel that.
So, Charlie, let's talk about the political impact of the economic impact. And to do that, I want to play what the Treasury Secretary said on CNBC when asked about what we're seeing: consumer confidence down, stock market down, and the overall impact. Here's that.
Could we be seeing that this economy that we inherited starting to roll a bit? Sure. And look, there's going to be a natural adjustment as we move away from public spending to private spending. The market and the economy have just become hooked. We've become addicted to this government spending, and there's going to be a detox period.
So I'm going to, talk to the experts on the economic part of that, which is this switchover that they see away from government spending. But just from an empathy to talk about this as just a detox period when the average American is hurting, how does that play, do you think? He's not the first one to give an answer that did not seem to include how the American people are being impacted by this.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is what voters voted for last year, this kind of detox pain, and I don't think that they voted for the kind of whiplash and confusion. I think there are a lot of voters who thought, okay, we'll have a little bit of disruption. But what you are seeing is government by whim. Donald Trump is, I think, enjoying the chaos because he wakes up every morning and decides who he wants to punish and who he wants to reward. But for millions of Americans who are out in the real world, I mean, this is incredibly disconcerting. Do you buy a car? Do you not buy a car? You've had this discussion. And there's no reason to believe that this uncertainty is going to end because this is Donald Trump. He is the government right now. He is the decision maker. And you are seeing the way that his positions change with the wind, with his mood, with whatever it is. So that chaos and that uncertainty is baked into the reality that we live in right now, and quite frankly, that leads to all sorts of unpredictable reactions, including the downstream effects. I think that a lot of Americans may like what goes on in Washington, but everybody's going to be affected by this. This is going to have an effect on every single household, every single community, every single state, and right now, it looks like there's a possibility that he may break something that seemed unbreakable just a few months ago.